You may have already glimpsed this nifty BMW shot in our YouTube channel trailer. I'm Simon Jones from HitFilm.com, and in this tutorial I'm going to be taking a look at how to composite 3D models realistically into live action footage. Since HitFilm 2 was released, we've made a big deal of the 3D model features in HitFilm 2 Ultimate. We've shown UFOs, spaceships, helicopter gunships, all of which are very cool, but we thought it was about time we showed an example that doesn't blow things up. So, from the top, this is the model I'm using. You can get car models from all over the place, some free, some not. We tend to get most of our good models from turbosquid.com, where they've got a huge selection. We needed a new background plate for this shot, so I headed to the nearest car park and shot a quick handheld shot, making sure there was plenty of good data to track. This can then be tracked in your camera solver of choice, such as Mocha HitFilm, which is included with HitFilm 2 Ultimate, or something like Buju or PFTrack. We'll be going into more detail about using Mocha HitFilm in a future tutorial, by the way. As always with 3D models, you want to spend a bit of time in the 3D model import window, getting everything set up. This particular BMW model has a bunch of different materials for each part of the car, which is handy. I focused on three main areas to customize. First up, the windows. I wanted these to be quite reflective, so I increased the specular reflectivity and made sure that the opacity was at about 50%. With glass in 3D models, you can adjust the opacity to change how transparent it is, so if you wanted a tinted windows look, just increase the opacity. This material is the car's main body. Its default colour is white, but it's pretty rare for a car to actually look pristine white, so leaving it like this is an obvious giveaway that it's CG. So instead, I'm going to use this colour picker to select the white of the car in the background shot. You can see it's actually more of a browny grey, even though it looks white in the final shot. Diffuse reflectivity uses an environment map to create ambient lighting on the model. I put this up to 30%, which is pretty high, but it ensures that the car takes on the lighting characteristics of its surroundings. Finally, the body's specular reflectivity I put to 18%, so that the car would look quite shiny. BMW drivers do like cleaning their cars after all. The last material I tweaked was the interior. The seats by default are too bright and illuminated. The interior of a car, when in a relatively dark area such as a car park, actually becomes far darker than you might expect. If you look at the other cars in the shot, you'll note that the interiors are almost completely black and unlit. So I'm going to go drop the colours for the model's interior down so that it stays nice and dark as well. Now, when you're actually practically working on a project, you're unlikely to set all this up perfectly right at the start, as you'll want to make adjustments based on the scene. So as you experiment with your shot, don't forget you can jump back into the 3D model's properties at any point by clicking the grey cog in the media panel. Okay, let's talk about placement. My floor plane in the composite shot is aligned to the floor in the camera track. If you're using Mocha, you'll need to use a little trick to align the floor plane first. Basically, you create a new 3D point and then parent all your tracked points and the camera to that new point. You can then alter the orientation and position of that new 3D point to bring everything else into line with the floor plane. It's a little bit fiddly, but it does work. As I say, we'll be going into more detail on these topics in a future tutorial, but if you head over to Imagineer's website, they've already got a bunch of tutorials that really talk about how to use Mocha. If you're using a point-based camera tracker such as PFTrack or Buju or Synthesize, it should be doing this for you anyway. Okay, now I'm good to go, so I can drop my 3D model onto the timeline. From the active camera view, it's difficult to see if it's actually sitting on the floor. So let's switch to the front view. You can see now that the wheels aren't actually on the floor, the car's kind of halfway into the floor. Rather than just moving the model straight up, I'm going to actually change its anchor point, so that the anchor point is then at the base of the wheels. This can be done in the World Transform properties. After that, the layer is pretty much in position, but I know that the anchor point is now at the bottom of the wheels. By switching back to the active camera, we can now see where the car is in the 3D space and check out its size relative to the real cars in the shot. I can use the scale property to change the size of the car. When you scale a layer, it scales around the anchor point. Because I moved the anchor point earlier to the base of the wheels, Even as I change the size of the model, I know it will stay fixed on the floor. The next thing is to make sure the scale is actually correct. Usefully, this car park did have some real cars in it. So I simply rotated the model around and then positioned it over the top of one of the cars, and then scaled the BMW until it looked about right. The model can then be positioned wherever you want it in the shot, such as here, which is really bad parking. Okay, so let's look in detail at some tricks for blending a 3D model into a live action shot. Ambient occlusion is something we've mentioned in the past, and it really works well to bring out the detail in a model. It's a technique that creates localized shading, so where two surfaces meet, you'll get a slight darkening. It's something that happens in real life. If you look at the corner of a room, right where two walls meet, there'll be a slight darkening as the walls occlude light from each other. On this BMW model, it works nicely around the grille, the wheels, and the doors. Next up, you want to add some reflection, particularly when you're working with a shiny metal object like a car. This is done using environment maps. In an ideal world, you'd have a full-on wraparound environment map created from a panoramic image of your location, a bit like the New York one from the Avengers, which I covered in an unofficial tutorial recently over on my own channel. But that's not always an option. Surprisingly, you can actually get away with just using a still from your video, or an ordinary photo of your location. So there are two environment map options. You can choose Use Composite Shot, which will use your entire comp as the environment map. This doesn't work properly with a moving shot like this though, because it means the environment map will be moving as well, and you want your reflection to be stationary. Instead, I'm going to take a representative frame from the background video, then export it to a PNG image using the Options Export Frame option. I can now re-import that image and drop it onto the timeline as a disabled layer. In the Environment Map section, I can now choose Use Layer and then select that particular image. You can see that instantly the model fits into the scene better, reflecting the ambient light and of course getting those actual reflections as well. You have a lot of control over environment maps when you work like this. Okay, so let's turn it into an embedded composite shot by selecting it and then choosing Make Composite Shot up at the top of the timeline. Currently we've got a nice crisp image, which of course results in a nice crisp reflection. But if you look at some of the other cars in this shot, you'll see that metal doesn't actually tend to reflect perfectly. So in our embedded comp, I'll add a blur effect to the image. This will cause the reflection on the car to also be blurred. You can do more. For example, let's add a contrast effect and boost that up so that the highlights really show up in the reflection. You get the idea. You can really do whatever you want and you're not tied down to just using your source reflection. The next thing to do is the real 3D lighting. This involves placing 3D lights in the scene to match the live action scene. Now, you don't need to actually make a 100% realistic match of the lighting in the actual location. All visual effects are about creating an illusion rather than a simulation. Look for the primary light sources in your shot. Is the sun a factor? Are there prominent artificial lights? Where are they positioned? What colour are the lights? That kind of thing. So in this shot, there are three main light sources. The light coming down the ramp to the left, the light coming in from the open side of the car park to the right, and the overhead strip lighting. In the context of this shot, I'm actually going to ignore the strip lighting as it's very weak compared to the natural light. If I wanted to park the car directly underneath one of these lights, I'd probably approach it slightly differently, of course. Okay, so I'm going to create a point light. This I'll position quite close to the car. Because the light should be blocked by the wall of the car park, there's a couple of options. Now, I could set up an elaborate 3D set, recreating the geometry of the actual location and setting up realistic shadow blockers, but that would be mental. Instead, I'm going to use the fall-off setting. This diminishes the power of the light the further away you get from it. So if I set the fall-off to curve, you can see that the light now only affects the parts of the car that are close to the light. Using this, I can now position the light so that the front edge of the car is bright, with the rest falling away into darkness. This light is currently a bit too bright, so I'm going to adjust its intensity until I get something that more closely matches the light coming in from the side. I now need a bit of a fill light off to the right of the shot, so I'll add another point light and move it over to the right. I'll then drop its intensity right down as we just want a little subtle fill. As you can see, I'm not being super accurate with this or trying to directly simulate the actual lighting conditions. If I toggle light rendering on and off using the viewer control, you can see how much of a difference this actually makes. Just with a couple of approximated lights, the car looks immediately much more part of the scene. Okay, the car still looks like it's a bit floaty. This is because it currently doesn't have any shadows, and shadows are what gives the human eye the cues to understand whether an object is close to another object. In this case, the car needs to look like it's close to the floor. I need to create a shadow catcher layer. As far as HitFilm knows, this background plate is just a flat image. It doesn't know where the car park's floor is. So, I'll create a new plane. I'll make it quite large at 2000 by 2000, and I'll make sure that it's white. Once this is on the timeline, I'll change it to 3D, and then using its orientation, I'll rotate it 90 degrees so that it's flat on the floor. I'll also make sure that that plane layer is underneath the car model layer. I'm going to go into the plane's materials properties and turn off illumination. This means that any lights in the scene are not going to actually light this particular layer. Don't forget to go into the materials property for the 3D model and turn on shadow casting. Now, I could just go into my main point light over here and turn on car shadows. That definitely works okay. There is now a shadow being cast by the car, but due to the position of that light, the shadow that's cast is quite long. However, I don't want to move this light because the actual lighting is exactly what I want. So instead, I'm going to turn off shadow casting for that layer and then duplicate the light. And then, because everything's gone far too bright now, I'm actually going to drop the intensity of the duplicate all the way down to 0. In the duplicate, I'll now turn on shadows. Now this is where there's an interesting little trick. You'll notice that even at 0 intensity, this light is still able to cast shadows. This only works onto objects which have illumination turned off, such as the plane. I can now move this point light around. This way I can generate my shadows and my lighting using separate lights. Hence I can move the shadow light up higher to bring the shadow in closer to the car. Obviously we don't want this giant white plane in our shot. To get rid of that, I'll go to the plane's layer properties and change its blend mode to multiply. This has the opposite result of an add blend, and so removes bright areas and retains dark areas. Okay, this is now looking pretty nice. However, although we now have a 3D shadow being cast, we could do some extra darkening around the wheels and around the underside of the car. The inbuilt ambient occlusion can't help here, so let's do it manually. I'll create a new black plane, turn it into 3D, and then rotate it 90 degrees. It's now in the same position as our main shadow catcher. I can now go to the bottom view in the viewer and draw a mask shape around the shape of the car. So this is basically restricting that black plane shape to just the shape of the car. I'll also draw a mask around one of the wheels. If I go back to my active camera view, I can see that where I've drawn the masks, it now looks like there's some extra shadowing going on. With the main body mask, I'm going to feather it out quite a bit for a soft edge, and then use the expansion property to shrink it back down. The same can be done with the wheel, adjusting it until it looks about right. I'll then jump back into the bottom view and duplicate the wheel mask several times, moving each duplicate until all 4 wheels have a mask. This new plane layer I'm going to parent to the 3D model, so that when I move the 3D model, the plane will move with it. You can see that we now have 2 layers of shadowing. One is a subtle ambient occlusion hand-drawn layer, and the other is the real 3D shadow cast by the lights. Basically, you're getting the best of both worlds. Something that's easy to overlook is that you can actually directly grade your 3D models in HitFilm 2 Ultimate. Let's do a little bit of grading to this model to blend it into the shot more naturally. To begin with, I'll add a brightness and contrast filter and drop down the contrast a bit so that the blacks aren't quite so computer generated looking. Then I'll drop on a color correction wheels effect and tweak it so that we match the background a bit more. The shadows I'll drop down to a bluey green, matching the ambience of the car park's roof and walls. Then the highlights I'll push ever so slightly towards yellow, matching the warm exterior sunlight. It's a very subtle change, but actually makes a big difference to the finished product. The last alteration is actually to add a blur effect. Now, although I filmed this background to be in focus using the FS700 stock lens, it is still a little softer than our computer-generated BMW. A blur effect set to a radius of 1 and iterations of 1 helps to soften the model slightly so that it doesn't look quite so crisp. I'd say the shot is now ready for overall grading. Color grading is particularly useful when you're working with visual effects, as it helps to bind everything together. Whether you go for something subtle or something extreme, it will help to make everything feel as one. So one thing to remember is that the techniques I've been talking about in this tutorial actually apply to pretty much any 3D model compositing you might be doing. So it's not just specific to this 3D BMW. For example, I could take out the BMW and replace it with something else, maybe something slightly more abstract, like, I don't know, a giant piece of fruit, maybe an apple. Thank you for watching, especially if you got all the way to the end. We'll be back soon with more exciting adventures in filmmaking and visual effects. See you on the next one.